Hello, welcome back to the studio. As you can see, I've got a canvas set up ready for today's painting. And this one is a Bob Ross classic, and it's done in portrait style. I'm going to have a go at painting this painting, and it's called Wilderness Falls. And it's a tricky painting. It's one I've done before in the past, and I have to say, I think it's one of the harder Bob Ross paintings. So why would I say that? Well, there's a number of features which you need to take into account. Firstly, I think there's more than one horizon line. You've got the obvious one here, which is the difference between where the water meets that background land, but then just above it there's another layer which conceivably could also be seen as the horizon line. And then if we look beyond that, there's even the horizon line at the base of this mountain. And we've got to allow room for all of this to squeeze into our painting. And it's tricky because, well, it's easy to run out of position. In other words, we could end up with sort of all of this being sort of squashed down too far, the mountain slipping too low, and then it all being a bit of a sort of a muddy mess in here, trying to squeeze it all in. So this is a painting, I think, which is quite a challenge, and one which I hope I can do a good job on. So let's get started and figure out which of the horizon lines I'm going to mark out. 1 or 2, maybe even 3 horizon lines. Let's make a plan. Right, let's look at our reference picture again. And I think the first one, the most obvious horizon line to put in is this one here at the very, very far end of the painting. And it is a little over halfway. And it's an unusual horizon line because most of the time I talk about horizon lines being 1/3 here or 1/3 there, or even 1/4 and 2/3. 1/4 and 3/4. I'll get my fractions right in a minute. But here we have the horizon line set almost 50-50. It's a little unusual. But the very fact that we've got an awful lot of things crossing through it means that actual fact, this horizon line is actually only that big. And that's really quite important, because if we had a big long horizon line for, say, a seascape, it might look a little bit sort of a painting of two halves. But with just such a short amount of horizon line, well, we can sort of get it. So you see, nothing's really set in stone with painting, so we need to go maybe a little bit higher than halfway. We have to allow room for some sky, and then we have to a bit of a chunk here for some distance for the mountain and mid-ground, and a sort of a distant sort of mid-ground here as well. So we have to allow a little bit of room for a mountain. And I'm going to just sketch this onto my canvas here. Another reason, the fact that I just need to know roughly where I'm going. Looks like there's a couple of nice little distant sort of hillsides there, very faint and very soft. Again, Bob was a master at getting depth and distance into his work. Let's drop that in, the horizon line. I'll measure this up, make sure I've got it pretty level, and then I think we'll put some liquid white, but I'm going to do just the top half, and that way you're not sort of rushing to try and get this bit done. We can get this bit in, and then we can pull down a few little reflections, and then we'll be absolutely fine, laughing tea cakes for the rest of it. So as you can see, I drew a line across here to make that nice sort of firm horizon line, and I put in those couple of pencil lines, you can just see them. But to reinforce the idea of where these lines are, I put in some of these little map pins. Now, I use these quite a bit. I don't make too much reference to them, but what they do is they're just simply the little pins you can buy from stationers. And sometimes I don't actually draw a line, but what I do is I push these into the wooden stretcher bars at the side of my canvas, and it gives me a very quick reference. So I know as I'm painting away here, I'm unlikely to roll too far past that set point. Let's get on with putting some paint on this, and I'm going to start off by using, let me go and get it. And this is a Bob Ross liquid white oil paint. You've seen me use this product many times before. This is a Bob Ross painting, and the idea here is we're going to put a very thin, even coat of this liquid white onto our canvas, and then we can actually blend colours on top. If we look at the reference photograph, you can see this is quite a pastel painting. All this background is so pastel. And I need a lovely sort of soft white colour to start with. This will enable me to blend all my colours into the distance. I don't use it from the can. What I do have is a little pot, And this is something I pop into the freezer and it stops it drying out completely. And I talked about that in my last little video. So a little pot of liquid white, drop it in the freezer, it'll stay good for months. And to apply it, I'm going to be using one of my old Bob Ross landscape brushes. There we go. And I'm going to take just a small amount. You can see it's like very sort of soft cream. And all I really need to do here is to just apply a small amount as far as the camera picks up, but I can still just about see my line. So you can see drawing on your canvas can actually be very useful. There's a couple of little blue marks there from, well, it was from my previous painting when I took the canvas down and put this one back up. I got some on my hands and it left a calling card on this painting. So there we go, a bit of DNA was transferred on my hands. There you go, quick fingertip test. This is the way I test my canvas. And what I want to see is just a trace of liquid white on my fingers, not too much and not too little. Quick look at my palette. I've just put out a few colours to start with. Titanium white, phthalo blue, Prussian blue, touch of black, a little bit of alizarin crimson. I like to give this a little bit of a dry clean first on some paper towel. Just give it a little pinch and a squeeze. You don't have to go completely mad. Just knock out some of that surplus liquid white that might sort of kind of get into your paint a little bit too much. Now, the sky. In the instructions it says use a little bit of phthalo blue, and I happen to know that this colour is, it's a strong one. So I'm going to take just the smallest amount, and I'm going to start up here in my corners. I might cool it down with some Prussian blue. Now, here's a little trick for you. If you want to paint clouds without painting clouds, the liquid white was already there. So you sort of got a cloud shape without really having to try too hard. It's definitely a neat trick and one that I often use. In Bob's one, it definitely looks much more like Prussian blue. So I'm going to make a decision. I'm going to go into some cool Prussian blue. I don't care what the book says. But sometimes you have to just do what makes you happy. I take a little extra time to blend them, to make sure I'm happy with them. I stand back often, because if you start painting something over the top of this now, put a nice tree in or a mountain or something, and then you stand back and go, oh, I don't like that bit, it may be very difficult to get back in there to fix it. And I learned that lesson the hard way more than once. So now, whenever I do a painting of my sky, something which is going to be very hard to change if I don't like it, I stand back and I consider it for a good few minutes before I move on. And I think I'm about right. Okay, let's paint a mountain. Against this, with some snow on it. And if this sky's too pale, and guess what? My mountain's just not going to show up. Let's take a little bit of phthalo blue into it. That makes a pretty lavender colour, doesn't it? So let's scrub a little bit of that into there too. Look at that, just that little tiny bit of paint. See how it just changed my painting? Now, if this happens to you and you think, ooh, that's a bit strong, don't carry on applying it and then wish you hadn't. Stop, get a paper towel, knock out some of that paint, and then with a dry clean brush you can sort of blend this out a little bit better. That's a little happy accident, isn't it? Fortunately there's going to be a mountain over this, so I'm not too worried about it, and there's going to be lots of background hills and the like. There we go. If you wonder who was that in the background meowing, that is Poppycat. I don't know what she's meowing about. I'll have to go and find out in a minute. There we go. So a little bit more that soft lavender colour. Original painting. His background mountain was a mixture of some Prussian blue, a little tiny touch of black, and some alizarin crimson for a base colour. So basically a sort of a greyish blue colour, maybe a hint of purple. this was, say, the base colour, but that's way too dark. So we have to adjust it with a little bit of white. So I'm going to put some white down beside it. I don't want to necessarily change this all at the same time. I want to be able to bring one of these colours into the other and sort of get a nice sort of blend of colours. And you'll often see me do this where I've got the base colour and some white, and I'll do this sort of a spectrum of colours so I can dip into my paint at several different points and get several different values. Bob used a palette knife to do his mountain, but I fancy to use a filbert brush. So let's get a filbert brush, get a little bit of this mountain colour, and this is going to be for the sort of the left side of my painting, which is where the mountain is more in shadow. So I can just about see the top of my mountain peak. It's not quite in the centre, it's a little bit to the left of centre and a good distance down. I've got to get it into this gap, so I can't come down too far. So I'm going to just sort of sketch in the left side of my mountain first. And drag it across the canvas. And by doing this, you can sort of create nice sort of textured surfaces. You don't have to do too much work with it. Now again, it's going to have to go and finish somewhere over towards here. So I'll put a little bit of a mark on there. Notice also I kind of like my mountain to finish in two different places. I don't like it to sort of be too level. Again, you decide when you're doing your own paintings, you sort of stand back from it and have a look at it from a few feet away. And as I say, you have to really kind of stand up and walk away from your painting for a few minutes. It's just no good leaning back in the chair and then carrying on. You have to actually get up, walk away completely, cross to the other side of the room, turn your back on your painting and then look back at it from some distance away. It is the only way you can really see how your painting's looking. Does it look like it's going to work? Is it right? Does this need to be a little bit taller? Does it need to be a little bit more pointed? Maybe I'm going to give it another 1/4 of an inch. There we go, make it a little bit more of a peak. Maybe I'll add something over in here, going off into the distance. See, you don't see these things if you're sitting on top of it. I can't stress that enough, folks. Don't sit on your paintings, move away. Adding a little bit of snow, I'm simply going to wipe my filbert off, get rid of all of that paint, and I'm just going to go into some of this white paint. It's got a little bit of the purple colour, it's a bit contaminated, which is good. I think it needs to be a little bit more contaminated. A nice sort of softish pink tone there. Now the light's coming this way, so I'm going to hold my brush super gentle here. You just want the brush to bump on the surface of the painting. Again, no heavy detail here. There isn't a lot of paint on my canvas. Okay, there isn't a ton of liquid white. There isn't a lot of blue. There isn't a lot of lavender. And because there's so little paint on here, it means that I can get my paint to stick to almost a dry canvas. And I think this is probably where a lot of people struggle a little with their paintings, is that putting on a little bit too much paint, a little bit too much liquid white, a little bit too much blue, a little too much crimson, and then suddenly you've actually got a painting which is really quite wet. And it's then hard to make things stick, because as you try and make it stick to the canvas, all you're doing is you're just picking up all the paint underneath. Let's finish this off now, and I'm going to just mist this bottom edge out, and I've got a clean, dry, soft brush. just simply tap, and I'm just going to fade this away. I want it just to fade off into the distance. Get rid of that edge. I don't want to see this edge here. I want this to look like it's, again, fading away into the mists. A couple of little footy hills in here as well. Just about got room for them. Again, it's the same sort of colours, but maybe just a little bit of this lavender colour in here. And I'm just going to tap these in. Back to my soft brush. The misty layer. That's what Bob called a separator. In Bob's instructions, as he works forwards, he introduces Indian yellow into this background, and you can see in the photographs there's sort of a blush of Indian yellow. Again, I'm not that keen on it, but I'm going to put some Indian yellow in with my base colour in here because there is a subtle shift, a little bit of a green colour coming through. And Indian yellow, well, maybe that's the colour we want to use. It gives us sort of a nice sort of, almost like a camouflage green colour. Again, it doesn't want to be strong at this stage because it's still quite distant, so maybe we'll just kind of just introduce a little bit of some greenish sort of trees through here. There we go. So these could be little sort of distant fir trees. So I'm literally just going to paint them in like that. I'm just looking more for the kind of impression of some tree shapes that could be fir trees. The Indian yellow colour in occasionally. That looks a bit too yellow, doesn't that? Let's tone that down a little bit. There we go. So you see, as I'm painting, I change my colours, I vary things, I pull different colours in all the time so that my landscapes have lots and lots of variety and variations in it. And there's going to be a big fir tree through here, so I'm not going to sweat too much over that. But again, you see, by varying your colours a little bit, by letting the paint blend together and work together a little bit, you can get lots and lots of subtle variations in your painting that you don't always know you're going to get when you start out. And if you want to give this top edge a little bit more of a softer look, you can give it a little flick. I'm just using just a few hairs on the corner of my brush here, just to kind of lift up. Again, it just adds a little bit of softness to my tree line. There we go. Doesn't have to be much. Yeah, it's just starting to come together, isn't it? Now, I think Bob did all of his background trees using a 1-inch brush. But then he was on a bigger canvas than me, so he's got a little bit more, I call it real estate, he had a little bit more room to manoeuvre than I do. So if you want to really make some little details in here, you can. You can even put some little side branches on fir trees. This is something I've done in the past, use a filbert brush, kind of create the look of a fir tree or two. You can go to town a little bit with this now because this is closer. So here's my painting so far, and as you saw, using pins means I've been able to stay on track with those different horizon lines. But this painting isn't without a few challenges still. The first one, I think, is probably fairly obvious, is the spaces And the shapes here, you see, we're sort of kind of hardwired to reproduce shapes. As I've done one line of trees here, it reproduces the previous line, and that produces the copy of the previous line. They're all very straight, all very even, like lines of type. Now, I'm not too worried about it for this particular painting because, as I say, I've got a big tree coming through here and I've got other things coming through here. So these lines are going to be cut up with other lines crossing through them. But if this was the finished background, I might be looking to make some changes to some of these shapes. Not to imitate the previous shape, of course, but to try and throw a little variety in there. It's just one of those things, a subtlety of your own paintings you have to look at sometimes. Now, this isn't the last of those horizon lines because there's another one here which is for the water and its reflections, and then below it there's the waterfall, and then that has also got another horizon line which is where the waterfall drops into the pool coming forwards. So you see, I've moved my pins down and introduced more targets for me to aim at. Now, the other thing which I have to look at on my painting is scale. When I look at Bob's original painting, and I'll bring it up over on the side here, these trees in the background are widdy little things. And my trees have become a little bit too big. So the size there wasn't so bad, but the whole thing just looks like it's been magnified a bit too big. So we do have some challenges still with this painting. I told you this was one of Bob's more challenging scenes. And the very last, if that wasn't enough to cope with, is that Bob did the foreground with this. And this is Bob Ross Liquid Black. Now, if you haven't used this stuff before, kind of interesting, but gosh, you can get yourself into a mess with it. So I propose not to use Bob Ross Liquid Black. I'm going to underpaint this with just some nice dark greens and blues, a bit more like Bob would do most of his paintings. So sit tight, let's add some water, reflections, and of course that lovely waterfall. So let's pick up my painting, and I want to add the water in here. Now this is done on liquid white, and then in Bob's original painting he lets the liquid white slowly fade into liquid black. So there's sort of a greyness here and then black to the bottom half. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use some liquid white in this section, and then I'm going to add liquid clear for this section so the bottom part of my painting doesn't become too pastel. It's a bit of an experiment, but it's worth having a go. Now, we've only got to cover this little section here, so one small dab of liquid white is probably what I need. And I'm just going to come up to and bump into the edge of liquid white that I put on yesterday. And this again answers another question which I get asked often. Can I stop a painting and restart it? And as you see, I did the top part of this painting yesterday, and today I'm going to do the bottom half. Now, I'm not too worried if you can see a line through there because I'm actually going to be pulling down some reflections. That's right, this paint is still just wet. So yes, it is definitely possible to stop and restart a painting. You've just got to be aware that there's sometimes little borders and edges which need to be crossed. With a bit of practice, it's very easy to work your way round them. There we go, just a nice thin coat. Just going up into the bottom of those little trees, grabbing a little bit of the colour and just pulling it down so that you don't see any hard lines. And of course the other bird this stone gets is that it means I can reduce down the size of my trees a little bit because they were a bit on the tall side. So 2 birds with 1 stone. Now let's do something with these reflections to make them look a little bit stronger. I'm going to put a little bit more paint on there and just pull straight down. Gosh, I nearly jumped the gun again there, didn't I? I should put some of the sky colour down here in the water first. You see, you've got to be on your toes when you're painting sometimes. It's very easy to sort of just blunder along and get into the wrong sort of thinking with everything on a painting, isn't it? So there we go. Back into some blue. You see, I tidied up my palette yesterday. Back into a touch of blue to make a nice lavender with some crimson. And again, not very much paint on my brush. In fact, you can see I've got a bit too much on that corner. It's got a bit of a heavy blob of paint there. So let's knock off some surplus. I want this to be quite nice and pastel. I don't want there to be a lot of colour here in the water. And again, edge to centre, pull across. I wonder, do I want to put some little touches of crimson in there? Maybe I do, little flecks. What I did then is I just literally rubbed my brush on a little tiny touch of alizarin crimson. Just want some of these little subtle hints of colour. And oops, you see just a speck of phthalo blue and I'm in trouble. Dry clean my brush. Now what would you do? Do you panic and try and scrape it all off and do things with it? No, first thing to do, knock off all the paint from your brush and then see if you can just, with a clean dry brush, just work it into the liquid white. 9 times out of 10, that's exactly what will happen. And as you know from the sky, you can always put some white over it and go again. So the trick is just to attack things with a nice clean dry brush. You'd be surprised how often you can fix something which looks like it's going to be a bit of a disaster. Now, I think this is about as much colour as I want. Let's do some little reflections. As I mentioned, I cleaned up my palette yesterday, but I still got my colours, so I've still got that original dark green colour. And I'll put that over on one side. And let's just add a few streaks of colour in here. And if you put in something, and now let's do something. If you put in a blob of dark down here and you think, it doesn't match what's happening above, then make it match what's happening above. It's as simple as that. No, there's nothing really ever too technical about my fixes. They're usually fairly common sense. See, so I've sort of done something that looks a little bit similar in terms of colour and size. It's pretty close. And I think most people would accept that. Knock a little bit of paint off my brush. And as I say, there's very little paint on my canvas, which means I can press into that paint and pull down and it won't move too far. There we go. Now, edge to centre. If you go the other way, you'll leave a dirty mark. So if I go edge to centre and then lift off, come the other direction, just enough to blur this and make it look a little bit like it's watery. Bob put some little bits of green grass in here, like a little riverbank, which I don't think I've got room for. I wouldn't say I'm on a smaller canvas, but I do want a waterline, and that's the colour I'm going to use. You see, it's anything but white. It's quite grubby, but when it hits my canvas, I'm pretty sure it'll look quite bright. There we go. There you go. Bright enough to be seen, but not overly bright. And try and make sure it looks fairly level. So this is quite a blue colour. And if anything, I like it to be slightly higher in the centre and dipping at the edges, so it looks like you're looking into the distance. That little bit of a curve to it, of course, really helps. There you go, a little bit higher there. Steps down, steps down, steps down to the right. There. Time to add some liquid clear. Now, let's have a look at our reference photograph. I'll bring that up here in the corner of my screen. talk about why I'm using liquid clear for this part of my painting. As I mentioned, originally Bob did all of this was done in liquid black, and then colours were blended over the top of it, so this was quite a greyish dark scene at the bottom here. And I'll be honest, I looked at the instructions and thought, well, I don't really fancy doing the liquid black. I fancy doing something different. Now, I had two options here. I could have done underpainting in this area with some black gesso, blocked it in completely, all in black gesso, and then just used liquid clear over the top, and that would have gotten me a very nice deep dark shadowy sort of foreground, much like liquid black, but using black gesso instead. But I've opted to try and use liquid clear, and the reason why I'm going to be using liquid clear down here is because I'm going to be putting some transparent sort of colours over it. So I'm going to be using some phthalo blue, maybe a touch of black in here, so you'll see a little bit of colour here, and then I'm going to use lots of green tones here. They'll also be sort of semi-transparent, so instead of being really heavy in the foreground, it'll be maybe a little bit lighter in tone, but not completely. I want dark shadows. So it's just a different way of tackling a scene. Now, I've got some liquid clear, and I keep some in a small airtight container like the liquid white, and I've got a clean dry Bob Ross landscape brush, and I'm going to take just a small amount, and I'm going to just work this into 4.5. It's a little bit stringy looking, look at that. I've dipped into the top of it and there's a little bit of skin on it. Let's fix that. It won't make much difference to my painting because I'll be working this into the canvas really well, and I'm going to come up to and just kind of bump into my waterline here, so there will be a bit of a blend going on here. A little bit of this white and blue colour will get down into the lower part of my painting, but not enough to worry me. As we know, you don't want to be too wet. You want to be able to apply enough paint to work with, but not too much. I'll do a little bit more time-lapse over this because it's, well, you can't see what I'm doing. And by the way, if you hear lots of bumps and bangs and crashes in the background, our neighbours are doing some building works and the scaffolders are busy putting it up. Okay, let's get on. Now, I finished covering this in with liquid clear, and the way I test is to take my finger and run it across the surface. And what I don't want to see is I don't want to leave a trail. I just want to feel the slightest amount of oil on my fingers. And if you're not sure about using liquid clear, I made a video all about it. And once again, there'll be a link up in the corner of the screen, or I'll put a link down in the description. But suffice to say, this is a thin, even coat, and when I look from the side, I can't see any dull spots. So I know that everything's got a very thin coat of liquid clear. And I can apply some colour to this now. I'm going to use this brush again to apply some colour, and as with the liquid white, the last thing I want to do is to put any more liquid clear into my painting, so I give it a quick dry on a piece of paper towel. And let's have a look at my palette. I want to underpaint the waterfall, and there's lots of foreground water in here, and I'm going to use my Prussian blue, which is nice and dark. Maybe I'll put some black into it. So you see, I'm using up all these little bits and pieces of paint. Now, position-wise, waterfall dead centre? Maybe not. I'm going to just move it off to one side slightly. I mean, just we're talking like a quarter of an inch, but it's quite vital that we don't have it all kind of too sort of central. And I know where the pins are there, so that's going to be the very top of my waterfall. And the water comes in and sort of drops in a nice sort of funnel shape like that. Now this is the underpainting colour, but I still like to get the shape right and make sure this sort of comes fairly straight down. And this is probably going to be a fraction wider than I really need it, because I think to myself, well, I'm going to put some rocks in at the side, so I'm probably going to lose a little bit. So I sort of make it a little bigger than I think I need it. If you're painting waterfalls, make sure you do a really good, strong, dark underpainting. I think I see quite a few waterfalls that look a little bit, well, a little bit kind of not got enough kind of oomph to them really. And that oomph is the fact that there's not enough dark underneath the actual falls and the water, and it looks a little bit sort of weak and wishy-washy. Now, so yeah, darken this up. Make sure it's got a good dark base colour to it, so your water, when you're cascading over the top, really sort of shows up. Now, sitting and looking at this, that's dead upright, but from your angle, this is all looking a little bit like it's leaning. It's one of those elliptical eloptions that is caused when you're filming at an angle. And there's going to be lots of rocks and things all in here, and either side lots of vegetation, which is going to be done in green. My green underpainting colour, I'm going to combine sap green with black and Prussian blue, and I want a really good deep green colour here. So a bit heavier on the sap green. I want a sort of nice vibrant green colour. Now I'm going to add one more colour to this, and that's some phthalo green. Now go easy with this colour, folks, because like its brother phthalo blue, this one is a real bully. My goodness, this will take over your entire painting in a heartbeat. So a little bit of phthalo green and mix it in with it, and then see what the colour changes are like. Okay, so as you saw, I did the phthalo green and got a nice sort of shade of green here, not too sort of fluorescent green, and mixing with the other colours quite good. Now I'm going to carry on using this brush. It's got some of that Prussian blue colour from my waterfall. It won't hurt this green, it's a powerful colour. And this time I'm going to go through my paint in one direction, just pull it through the paint, give it a little push, and you can sort of hopefully see on my palette there, sort of a nice texture being built up. This stippled texture is what I'm going to underpaint these bushes and trees with. Now, because I don't really know what kind of things are going to fit just yet, I can't really plan too much. All I do know is that there are going to be two big rocks at the top of the waterfall and some rocks down the side, maybe a few rocks in here as well, and some rocks along the edge. So you see there's lots of features that are dotted around. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to literally add this on by sort of pressing it into the canvas and creating this lovely sort of texture. It looks like foliage already, doesn't it? But I'm going to take this dark mass of green colour, I'm going to turn it into some more individual little features on my painting. I actually have to tone this down a fraction, and I can do that quite easily. I'll take a little black, a little bit of Prussian blue, work it into that colour. Work it in with your brush. Let's see what happens. See, just a subtle change of green. And cut through the horizon line here with another tree or a bush. And that's going to be something through here. I'll do something more with that in a minute. Actually, in fact, you're just going to be left with a small section of water in the background here. There we go. As I say, I'm going to have some rocks down the side here, so that'll sort out the boundary between the bushes and the waterfall. Rocks in here, rocks down the side, maybe some rocks along the top there. We'll see how that all fits in, and then I'll probably come in with a smaller brush and just add in a little bit more foliage. So I just wanted to take a moment to talk about my painting so far and to look at a sort of an interesting development. You see, the foreground of my painting had been white or pale grey for a long time, and we sort of got used to that colour balance. There was a pale background and a pale grey foreground, but look what happens when I block in the foreground. That strong dark foreground colour somehow makes everything behind it look really sort of almost too pale, a little too washed out. Now I'm okay with the mountain because I want that to look nice and distant, but what about these trees? They look a bit sort of, well, a bit weak and willowy, don't they? They don't have quite enough colour. This is something that happens quite a lot when you're painting, and it's the reason why quite often you'll see an artist block in very quickly. They'll put in masses of colour, lights and darks, and they'll fill in foregrounds. They'll put in lots and lots of blocks of colour very roughly, very quickly. And it's so that you can sort of judge the balance of colours. So you don't end up with something like this, where maybe a row of background trees are just a little too pale. It's a very interesting way of working, and it's something I can see sometimes in my own work where I've just been a little bit too cautious with my colours in the background. So before I do anything else, should I come back in here and give this a little bit of a strengthen up? I don't know. I'm undecided because I know there's a big tree to go through here and there's some other details, and I'm probably not going to see lots of it. So if I did anything, I might just strengthen up one or two trees in here and fiddle with my reflections. But this is just another point of when you're painting. Another reason why this is one of the trickier paintings that Bob did. Lots of little sort of hiccups and places where you could, well, have those happy accidents. Or in my case, a pickle. Not too bad this time though. Let's carry on and put in the waterfall and put some more detail in, and then I'll make a decision about the background. So let's have a go at painting this waterfall. And I put out some fresh titanium white paint, and I've added to it a drop or two of linseed oil. For this technique to work, you've got to be sort of quite a nice decisive sort of stroke with your brush. There's no good sort of half-heartedly doing this. So the paint needs to be soft enough to actually flow, and so I've added linseed oil to it to really make the paint a little more liquid. Straight out the tube it's just too heavy and it won't sort of flow nicely. Now, what do you think of my colour? There you go, put it against my waterfall. I reckon that's pretty eye-popping. So that's a little too bright. So I'm going to tone this down with a little bit of that blue-grey colour. So let's take a little bit more of the Prussian blue colour, just a touch. I'll just grey it slightly, I'll just make it look a little less sort of vibrant. Again, this is something I do on my own waterfalls, is the temptation to want to just dive in with white paint and just paint these sort of columns of sort of bright white colour that don't really kind of look like a natural waterfall. Now, I've given myself a hard time here, haven't I, folks, because I've got to try and go across and down without sort of picking up a load of green colour. And, well, I'm not too worried about it. If I do, it's hey-ho. A little bit of green in my waterfall, I'm quite pleased with it. But what I don't want to have is just a hard start at the top. Okay, I think that's a better angle for you. What I've done is I took one of my brushes and I used my finger like a peg, and I held it against the side of my canvas, and then I went down the centre of my waterfall and I drew a little bit of a line there so that to let you see that that's a line that's parallel to the edge of my canvas. And you can see that it looks like it's leaning in at the top. I suppose it might be just a fraction. But that's actually a nice straight line through the centre of my waterfall. And it looks like it's leaning over to one side. It's all to do with camera angles, I'm afraid. The camera lenses tend to make things a little distorted. But that's the line, that's straight down. And what I want to avoid doing is having what I call a T-top, like a hard start to it. And so I like to put on just a couple of little strokes here so there's a bit of a lead in before I drop. And I'm going to start just above. Now, so there's my lead in colour, just a little bit brighter. So here we go, across the top, bit of an angle, bit of pressure, and let that brush just fall. Let gravity do the work for you. Which way the light's coming from. I might do a little bit more zigzagging up in here, a little bit more colour, and then down. Just let your brush fall. Not a great deal of paint on my brush for this. Press and let your brush just kind of fall. Now, if you want to come back and add a little more brightness, because you've got a nice bluish colour under here, you can actually go back in over with a little bit of light colour. There we go. So let's put in a little tiny zinger. There we go. See how I just dropped that in? This is just pure white now. Just pure white on the edge of my brush. The trick is to make sure you let your colours run out as you come down. And as they go down, I'm going to drop in just a few little taps of colour going back up. I'll try and put up a couple of little waterfall photographs to let you see this. But when water falls any kind of a distance, it doesn't sort of stay in a nice stream. It breaks up. So the air pressure causes things to block and to sort of fall apart. So there we go. And I'm going to use a nice, clean, dry, fresh brush. I'm going to just kind of tap this out and create a nice little misty area at the base of my waterfall. Look at that. I managed to squeeze it in without hitting any much of the green colours. That was good, wasn't it? Now, down in here, we want some nice splashes and crashes. Push that little brush in there, give it a few little upward presses. Give it a little push, push, push. And again, this is pretty bright down here. I might calm my colour down a little bit more. Again, you go back into some of that blue colours. And think about how the water would come forward and a little bit of a swirl to it. So I'm going to just zigzag a little bit, backwards and forwards, not too definite with that. I think I might put a few little rocks in there at the base of the falls. Again, if you collect a little bit of the green from the sides, that's quite nice. Let me move my hand back. So I'll probably pop in a few little rocks and stones down there. Maybe I'll just soften that up a little bit more. Not too much paint down here so I can have a little blend, a little play, a little fun with that. That was pretty good, wasn't it? A lot of fun with that. Yeah, I know a lot of people stress when they come to doing waterfalls. They get a little bit nervy about doing it, and I say just have some fun with it. Remember, make sure you start off with colours that aren't pure white. You want grubby, dirty colours. It means that you can do stuff like this without too many problems. Now, what do I do about this up in here? I think maybe just a few little ripples back there. And I'm still undecided about my green colour here, so I may drop in a few dark trees and then do a few ripples going across to the other side of the water here. So I might have to hold off on doing that a little bit, but I think I'll add some rocks next. Let's have a look at my palette. As you can see, I keep my palette in good condition. When I finish with the colour, I tend to clean it off and I'll clean up the central area of my palette, which was all covered in green before. I'd just put that over to one side. And I think this is another little tip for you. Keep your palette under control. Don't let it get covered in a million colours, some from like the very start of the painting, which you're never going to go back to. Hang on to them for a little while, and if you don't use them, then finally discard them. But yeah, keep your palette in a nice working condition. You'll find life so much easier if your palette isn't in a pickle. Now, for my rocks, I'm going to take some Van Dyke Brown, and I've got no black left. I'm going to use Van Dyke Brown and put a bit of black out. And to highlight them, I'm also going to use Van Dyke Brown with a little dark sienna, maybe a bit of Indian yellow. I'll see. But let's put some Van Dyke Brown rocks on first. And looks like Bob did this with a palette knife, with a filbert brush. But the instructions say palette knife, so I don't quite like using palette knives. And as I say, I'm just looking for some nice rocks to hold in the sides of the waterfall. Now, these rocks have got to be bigger or taller than the top of the falls for obvious reasons. If the rocks were down here, then what would hold the waterfall in? So this is where you have to, again, think about proportions and sizes. I'm just going to let this colour kind of bump into some of the green at the sides here, and as I say, These colours work quite well together. Nice little rocks down here at the base of the falls. And once again, remember, they're going down into the water, and the water, although it's choppy and moving, is largely a level surface. So you might see a rock that looks like a craggy lump at the top, but the base where it goes into the water, it will be flattish. Up here in Bob's painting, he's got several big rocks here too. And once again, this is something you won't see, these big rocks, which is dark on dark, but as soon as I hit that with some highlight, it will jump out. So I'm going to just block that big rock in. I think something down in here maybe. Not the same as that rock, but a nice piece of rock just there. But if I don't want it, well, I won't highlight it. To highlight my rocks, I'm going to use some Van Dyke Brown, and I'm going to use some dark sienna. And as always, I don't put them side by side. I always leave a gap through the centre there, and that's where I'm going to put my highlight colour. And it might be yellow ochre, or even a touch of white. The reason why I don't put the two darkest colours side by side is because they'll sort of run into each other very quickly, and you'll just end up with one sort of flat dark colour with a little bit of highlight sort of stuck on the edge. Whereas if you leave a gap through the centre, then you can sort of pull the colours about as you wish. Now my dark skin is a little bit on the, it's an old tube of paint, it's a little bit on the stiff side, so you can see it's a little bit kind of sticky and gooey, so it won't stick so easily, but let's see how we get on. Now, as you see, a big spectrum of colours, lights and darks all over, so I can sort of pick from wherever I want. And I'm just going to pick up a little bit of paint on the short blade of my knife. Now, the light is coming from the right hand side, so I think this rock is going to be fairly bright at the top. Finger and thumb, super gentle, and just let the paint stick where it wants. And I'm right, that paint feels really sticky and heavy and kind of gluey, but that's okay. Let's add a little more light to it. And again, you see, I just let the knife leave paint where it wants. Absolutely no pressure from me. I just let the knife run and bump. Paint doesn't come off, well, it doesn't come off. And I'm going into a darker mixture for the other side. I think this would be a little bit more in shadow. Maybe that's a little too bright. Down in here, I think again, we might see a little bit of bright colour on a rock, but not too bright. So sometimes you just have to put the rocks in and sort of, whoops, hope for the best. And then it'll all work out in the end. That paint there's very, very dry. And I'm literally just going to use the blade of my knife, just going to let it sort of skip across the surface. I'm not going to use any pressure again. I just want to leave just the suggestion of a highlight. If I have one of my little sayings I'm going to include in this conversation, and it's the best rock you paint is the rock you only paint once. By the time you try to fiddle with it and somehow make it look better, it's no longer the first one, it's the 5th version or the 6th version, but it gets more and more muddy. So the best rock is the rock you paint only once. Well, after a little bit of a sit back, and now I've got a bit of colour in here, I'm looking at these trees in the background again. Basically, I wanted to look at this a little more completed before I made a decision, but I do think some of these trees could be a little darker. Now, the challenge is that the colour I mixed up has long dried out, so I've had to mix up another tone and another sort of value. And this is where you can run into some serious problems going back and doing a little retouch if you haven't got exactly the right sort of kind of colour. Now, I do know there's going to be a nice big fir tree through here, so where better to have a little play than in this area. And if the colour's not quite right, it doesn't really matter, I'll cover it up. Now, there you go, that's the sort of colour I think would work. it's not a million miles from all the others. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to darken up a few of these tree shapes in the area just right above this waterfall. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to darken up some of these reflections, because I think that's where things are being let down a bit. My soft 1-inch brush, give it a bit of a dry clean, and reach in there and press and pull down. That looks a little stronger. Gently brush across. Grubby titanium white. Let's cut that through there, make a little waterline. A few little ripples and waterlines through there as well, just to add to the whole effect. Now before I mess this up, I'm going to paint a nice big fir tree. Now, one thing I would suggest when you're painting is to get yourself a couple of fan brushes, one that you can have for highlighting and one that you can use for darks. You can just do everything, of course, with one fan brush, but it means you've got to stop and clean up. Now, this is the brush I just used for the water, and this is a clean, dry one I'm going to use for underpainting my fir tree. And I'll add some nice yellows and greens to this for some highlights. And I'm going to go back into that nice dark green colour that we've used here, and I'm going to load my brush really well. This is a firm, dry colour, nice and sticky, and take your brush through and give it a good wiggle. Now, how big a tree do we go for here? We're going to go for something that ends sort of here. That's a little bit mean, isn't it? Or something a little bigger. Or something that really goes right through from top to bottom. In Bob's original painting, he went almost to the top of the painting. He went for a really big tree, which is fine. I don't mind something like that. I think it's quite good. So let's have a little look. And I'm thinking about thirds. My waterfall is approximately 1/3 across, and I want sort of something over towards this side. And I'll take it up through here. So there's enough room for it to grow. I'm probably not going to develop this too much. Let's see. About there. Maybe a bit further over. No, I think I'm around about there is where I'm going to go for. Now I know what you're thinking, what about that first line? I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to lose it in the foliage. Now, I want a tree with upward facing, so what I call little smileys. So put your brush on a corner and start by pressing upwards with the corner of the brush to create a little group of foliage. It's like a little upside down umbrella shape. And just carry on adding them. Bob's little fir tree is a really shapely, lovely one. Looks like a little bunch of umbrellas or chandeliers all facing upward. And I really like the shape of his tree. So I'm going to try and reproduce the same shape with my own painting. So do a little group, leave a little gap, and do another little group. I'm keeping it fairly narrow at this stage because there's a tendency for things to really run out of sort of position here. So again, from experience, I know that if I keep things a little more under control, then as I paint down, I can always go back over this and stretch it out a little bit. I'll do a little bit like that. Yeah, that's looking good. Maybe make this a little wider. That's it, looking good. And I'll grow this a little bit wider. There, I think it looks pretty good. I'll stand back and make sure I like it. If not, I can always grow it a little larger. I think that's about right. I put a bit more foliage on there. I think I'll just add a little tree trunk, and I'm going to use some of this marble mixture from the rocks down in here. And I might use the big blade of my knife. Just pick up some of this nice light brown and orange colour, and just through the centre, just do a few little touches. There we go. I'll put some highlight over the top of this, and that'll look good. To highlight my fir tree, I'm going to use my fan brush that I used for doing the waterfall. Let's say I gave it a bit of a dry clean. I knocked off some of the paint that was on there, but I don't mind having a bit of white through it. As you see, I'm going through some cadmium yellow. This is lighter and thinner and oilier, because Bob says a thin highlight colour will stick to a thick dark colour. And this is the underpainting colour, definitely dry and thick. This is the highlight, and this is very, very nice and soft and oily. I'm going to pull a little bit of sap green into this. Now then, what do you think? A little bit too vibrant? I think so. Let's tone that down a touch with some of the original base colour. Put a little bit of Indian yellow into it and get a little bit of colour on the edge of my brush. Give it a little tap and a push. Now, remember, the highlights are all on the right hand side, so that's going to be the brightest side of my tree. So I'm going to touch mainly to the right, a little to the centre, and not much on the left. So just touching. You see that highlight sticks instantly. If you find your highlights don't stick, it means that your colours are too similar in terms of their thickness. And you need to add a tiny drop of thinners to your highlight. Now, as you see, I'm going to come across the centre of my tree, give it a little push, save the dark. And as I come down my tree, I'll let my colour run out a little more. As I would say, darker, darker, darker. There we go. Now, I really like that little technique, pushing. And I like to use that same technique for highlighting my trees as well. So I'm going to use that same sorts of colours. And maybe I'll do a little bit of highlighting over on this bush or this little tree over in here. And think about this as not being like one big mass of colour. Think about this as being little individual branches. So maybe I'll do a few little upward presses to kind of create the illusion of there's nice branches through here. And then save a little shadow in here. You can always come back and add a few sticks and twigs. As you see, as I come down between these rocks, I'll refocus my camera over here. Save a little shadow through here as well. I'll load my brush again, give it a little push. Think about how the light would come across. Would catch a few of these little bits of foliage. Just a few little touches, a few little sparklers. Maybe this rock's got a little bit of shadow cast across the top of it. And remember, if you're going to try and make this paint stick over this rock, this has already got quite a lot of paint on it, so you might start sort of heading into sort of muddy situations. So I tend to try and aim for some of the darker areas. I think that's an easier target for a bit of highlighting. There you go. See, that just stuck nicely there. Down here in the corner, but I don't really want much of anything happening. Now let's grab the other side of my canvas and put some highlights there too. I quite like this yellow ochre colour mixed with a little bit of white on my brush. You see it's lovely and juicy. See how much oil's in that? That's a juicy colour. It'll stick lovely to this green colour. Remember, light coming from the right, so maybe I want to put a little bit of highlighting on that right hand edge. And just let it run out a little touch. And the good thing is, if you don't like the look of what you've done, you can always pick up your palette knife and take it off and do it again. So let's say I do something like this and I overdo it. Let's say I over highlight it. I've gone over this far too many times. Look, I've made myself a real pickle here, haven't I? Well, let's fix it. Okay, I'm going to pick up my palette knife and just gently scrape off that excess paint. And you always want to remove this paint before you try and redarken your canvas, because once you put this thinned out paint on here, you'll never get the dark colour to stick properly. It'll always just make a big sticky mess that's the wrong consistency. Remember, the dark colour needs to be firm and dry. So if you try and put firm dry paint over the top of a highlight, it's not going to be firm and dry anymore, is it? It's going to be sort of something in between. So whenever you're doing a repair, and this is pretty much a golden rule, always take off the paint that didn't work out well. Oh, and I got my fan brush with all the dark greens on it. So I can simply go back, stab that back in, retexture my canvas. And sometimes you can actually have some nice happy little accidents here sometimes. Sometimes you can just sort of do a little repair but leave some of it showing. Look at that. See, so not every repair needs to be a total makeover. Okay, and let's think about painting some nice little bushes in here. The very, very tip of my brush, just the corner, adding the suggestion of a little foliage. There we go. I think a few sticks and twigs, maybe a few little reflections and waterlines, and we've got our painting almost finished. Okay, down here in the water, I actually want to pull down some reflections of these rocks. So I've got my nice 1-inch brush back, and all I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab a little bit of the edge of that rock and just pull some of that down into the water. And so these rock colours are quite firm and dry. They don't really want to move very much, so I can give them a little flick. Blue-grey colour here on the edge of my palette knife. And I think I'm going to just drop in just a few little water lines around some of these rocks. Firm pressure. I think after 20 plus years of cleaning brushes, I'm quite sick of cleaning brushes, so I try and make one brush do as many jobs as possible before it finally goes for a bath. There we are. There we go. And it's also good practice, because sometimes you don't always have the right brush to hand. So get used to making brushes do jobs that maybe you hadn't thought of making them do. Like using a palette knife to put on the colour, and then a filbert brush for doing the nice job that a fan brush would do. And with that, I think I'm not far away from a finished painting. Maybe just a few sticks and twigs through here. I reckon I'm about there. So there we have it. A Bob Ross classic, Wilderness Falls. A painting that takes some planning. Lots of horizon lines, and you know what you need to put on your shopping list? These map pins. Now, don't move, because there's some more lovely paintings for you to plan to paint in future. Happy painting, people.